horror video games are special. It's a genre that doesn't just entertain, it immerses players in a visceral experience that's both thrilling and chilling. From the spine-tingling atmosphere of Resident Evil to the psychological terror of Silent Hill, horror games tap into our deepest fears and push the boundaries of interactive storytelling. What makes them truly unique is their ability to elicit genuine emotions, whether it's the adrenaline rush of narrowly escaping a relentless pursuer or the heart-pounding suspense of exploring a dark, desolate environment. In the world of horror gaming, every creaking floorboard and distant whisper serves to heighten the tension, keeping players on the edge of their seats and craving for more. It's a genre that thrives on the unpredictable and unknown, where the line between reality and nightmare blurs with each passing moment. Whether you're tiptoeing through the darkness with your heart pounding against your chest, or facing off against an unspeakable horror, the immersive experience of horror gaming is unmatched. Every flicker of light casts eerie shadows, every echoing footstep shivers down your spine, and every calm moment is ruined with the anticipation of what's to come. In the world of horror games, fear is not just a feeling, it's a companion. A constant presence that heightens every sensation and leaves you craving for more. There are many horror games that satiate these cravings. For horror is a medium that can be portrayed in a vast amount of ways. From the psychological horror of games like I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, to the survival horror aspects of games like Alan Wake 2. As touched on before, the Resident Evil franchise has a huge hand in horror, with Resident Evil 4 especially popularizing the third-person horror genre, bringing it into new heights with its enthralling gameplay and masterful characters and world building. Because of the popularity and innovativeness of Resident Evil 4, Visceral Games would pivot from working on System Shock 3 to working on a brand new IP, and nearly 3 years later that new game would be revealed as Dead Space. Much like the Resident Evil 4, Dead Space was a third-person, over-the-shoulder horror game. Unlike Resident Evil 4 though, it took place in space, on a mining rig known as the USG Ishimura. This game would quickly become a cult classic, and also lead to one of my favorite games of all time, the aptly named Dead Space 2, Electric Boogaloo. Both Dead Space 1 and 2 are widely regarded as masterpieces and staples of the survival horror genre, and one man is especially to thank for this. While he did not have as big of a hand in Dead Space 2, the world and characters of Dead Space were the brainchild of one Glenn Schofield, although it wasn't always called Dead Space. You see, during the early production stages, the game was known as Rancid Moon, and was based off a nightmare that Glenn had of a prison in space that had been overrun by monsters. Now to some, that premise may sound familiar. That's because nearly 14 years later, this nightmare would finally be brought to life in the form of Callisto Protocol. And oh boy, did that first trailer get me hyped.
This is Black Iron to transport ship Charon. You are cleared for landing.
After the huge disappointment that was Dead Space 3, EA had shut the doors on Isaac Clarke. So hearing that Glenn Schofield was back and making a spiritual successor to Dead Space, I was very excited. The build-up to this game was unlike any other as well. Leading up to its release, Striking Distance put out 2 projects to accompany the game. The first was a podcast that gave us a preview of the world we were about to enter. It focused on a character by the name of Percy, who was voiced by Gwendolyn Christie. And to put it simply, the story was incredible and extremely interesting, hooking me from the very beginning. I mean, it was so good I just couldn't put it down.
Sorry.
For those interested, I definitely recommend giving this a listen, and all episodes will be linked in the description. Striking Distance also released a docuseries titled Mastering Horror. This consisted of 3 episodes, diving into what they call the 5 tenets of horror for the Callisto Protocol. These consist of
brutality,
atmosphere,
tension, helplessness, and
humanity.
And when these 5 tenets are used in unison, it creates the perfect horror experience. After seeing all of this, as well as the other trailers they put out for the game, I was fully prepared to have a new favorite survival horror game. But unfortunately, when I finally got around to playing the game, I found the horror experience to be anything but masterful. Callisto Protocol was supposed to be a bastion of the survival horror genre. Yet it turned out to be a bigger abomination than that one guy from The Incredible Hulk. So join me as we take a look at the 5 core tenets of Callisto Protocol and how they created a monster instead of a masterpiece. What better place to start than brutality, the game's very first tenet? And I believe this is actually one the game does a pretty good job at. While walking through Black Iron Prison, you can see the brutality of the world we are in. There was one room at the very beginning of the game where guards are strung up on every inch of the ceiling, and walking through here gives the player a very uneasy feeling. The brutality of this game can also be seen in the death animations. While these do lack in numbers, the few that are in the game are definitely not for the squeamish viewer. From having Jacob get his legs ripped off by a robot, to getting his face eaten, these are pretty gnarly on their own, but hearing Jacob cry out in pain while they happen add a whole nother level of brutality to them. These animations aren't just reserved for Jacob though. During combat you can often get an animation while defeating an enemy. These animations are equally as brutal, and delivering them to an enemy that has killed you in the past can be very satisfying. I do think there was definitely some missed opportunities here, as we immediately get our first example of Glenn Schofield and the rest of the team having a very narrow view of what makes a good horror game. In the docuseries, Glenn equates brutality to shock value.
Brutality is part of that shock value. And shock is just one of the emotions of horror, right?
And while some of the death animations are definitely shocking, that's about all they are, and you can only get shocked by the same thing so many times. After that shock value wears off, there isn't much after. These death animations also happen very fast, and before you have any time to really be affected by them, you are put right back into the action to try again. The brutality is never given the time to affect the player in a meaningful way, and we also don't see it as part of the world. This is a topic I expand upon a little later, so I won't go too deep into it now, but Jacob is really the only person we see throughout the game, and because of this, the only violence we see is against Jacob. We never really truly get to see how brutal the biophage are, because the only time we see them, we are killing them. Other than the very beginning of the game, we don't see these creatures attacking other people. We don't see them feeding on dead corpses or picking the bones off of small animals. Because of this, the brutality feels shallow and is not very impactful. Moving into the second tenet is where the game really starts to fall apart. The atmosphere of this game is extremely lackluster, especially compared to the other titans of the genre like Dead Space and The Last of Us. I believe one of the major blunders this game has is ironically another topic they made a video discussing in depth. That is the game's lighting. In the video, Glenn Schofield admits himself,
All due respect to everything else in the game, lighting and audio are 80% of horror, and so we spend a lot of time on them.
This statement I 100% agree with. But this did not seem to translate into the game at all. There is a reason that so many people are afraid of the dark. When we can't clearly see something, our minds naturally start to wonder. We wonder if something is watching us. We wonder if something is stalking us. We as the people fear the darkness because what's in it is unknown. Horror games thrive off of this. In reality, your fears only go as far as your imagination. In a video game, though, you are at the complete whim of the creator. The player's mind becomes a battleground between rationality and irrational fear, as they struggle to discern between genuine danger and mere shadows. This psychological warfare is nowhere to be seen in the Callisto Protocol, simply because there is no darkness. Just look at some of these clips and you will see that everything can clearly be seen. Monsters are extremely well illuminated, offering nothing to the imagination. There is nothing here to fear. Now let's compare this to a similar scene from Glenn Schofield's original work, Dead Space. Here you can see a pretty stark difference. In Dead Space, the dark and gloomy corridors only show the player what they need to see, in turn making it a place that the player is extremely uncomfortable in. In Callisto Protocol, there is really nothing to be frightened by. What you see is what you get. Atmosphere also plays a big part in the map itself. Black Iron Prison is extremely linear, offering very little to explore. Occasionally there may be something hidden away, but even in these areas the additional world building and lore is extremely limited, and so it's not really worth exploring. This also takes away any replay value the game might have had, as there is no reason to go back and see what you missed. This linearity makes the player feel extremely limited, and in turn makes the environment and atmosphere feel underbaked and uninteresting. Where the atmosphere in the game is a misstep, the tension is a full slip and fall. This tenet may be the worst offense just for the way it was presented in the docuseries. Why don't we listen to the way Scott Whitney, the game's creative director, describes the tension in the Callisto Protocol?
Well, when you think about horror, it's not just sort of an endless series of jump scares one after another.
For those who played the game, you might find this line quite ironic, because that's exactly what the game is. The Callisto Protocol is a game that relies on jump scares, more than 5 Nights at Freddy's. There are segments of this game where within a 5-minute span, there may be 10 jump scares right after one another. Now, jump scares can be scary. When I first watched the Insidious movie, I had nightmares because of the devil jump scare. The problem with jump scares in the Callisto Protocol is that they are so overused that it actually desensitizes the player to them. The more you play the game, the less effective these jump scares become, and in turn the more predictable they are, which takes away any real horror element this game might have. Another way tension in this game fails is the enemies themselves. I believe that when it comes to the Callisto Protocol, the enemies are not effective because of 3 key issues. The first being the combat. For those who have not played Callisto Protocol, it is a very melee-focused combat system, which is an extremely poor decision for a horror game, as it immediately lessens the threat of the enemy. I should be terrified of what I'm facing. I should want to put as much distance as possible, but the game literally makes me face my fears. The game forces me to look at my fears in the face and beat them to death. When I took that first swing and killed one of these monsters with a crowbar, I immediately didn't fear them anymore. Combat is also extremely sluggish and awkward, as it is heavily animation based, with a dodge mechanic that relies solely on a button that you always have your finger on. The game also does not seem to have a stamina bar of any kind, meaning you can dodge and attack again and again without having to put any strategy or critical thinking into it. This all combines to make a combat system that feels less like a high-octane intense battle, and more like a turn-based system, where you sit and wait for the enemy to attack, so that you can dodge. Then you get to attack a couple times before getting ready to dodge again. This is only perpetuated by the fact that the enemies in this game are extremely considerate of the player, as they will sit there patiently waiting for their turn to attack you. Enemies behind you will also grab and turn you around, instead of attacking and take away any danger that comes with facing a group of enemies, or getting caught off guard by having your back turned. Throughout the game, a couple of different enemy variations are introduced, yet every single enemy does the exact same thing. Doesn't matter if it's a basic grunt or a mutated riot guard. Each enemy is extremely easy to face in combat. This makes the game just feel like a chore to play, as you fight the same enemies the same ways again and again in a combat system that is extremely repetitive. The game also fails to provide the player with an overarching threat to be worried about. In Dead Space, there will be many times where Isaac is grabbed abruptly by an outstretched arm, and you have to quickly shoot it before it drags you to your death. After each encounter, you'd be speculating about the creature that grabbed you, as his arm was absolutely massive. Eventually, you do fight this Leviathan, and it takes everything in your arsenal to take it down. This type of boss fight is nowhere to be seen in the Callisto Protocol, and in fact the only boss fight present is reused 4 different times. The only real looming threat that is in the Callisto Protocol is Captain Ferris, who we watch die at the beginning of the game, and he isn't seen or heard from until halfway through the game, where he just shows up to do a little scare before disappearing again. I feel like this was a huge missed opportunity, as Captain Ferris, being a guard, would know his way around Black Iron Prison pretty good, so he could almost be like a character similar to Resident Evil 3's Nemesis, where he's constantly chasing you, forcing you to be quick and precise with every action and movement. This leads into Callisto Protocol's next tenet, which is helplessness. To this game's credit, it does start off pretty well in regards to helplessness. Combat is pretty easy, yet enemies do have a good chunk of health, so you have to stay focused while in combat, as one slip up can lead to you getting killed. There are two things in the game, though, that completely undo any helplessness that you may have felt throughout this game. The first is an item you get very early in the game. It is known as the GRP, or grip. For those who have played Dead Space, it is a carbon copy of Isaac's telekinesis ability. Yet in the Callisto Protocol, they make one change that completely breaks the game. You see, in the Callisto Protocol, you can use the grip on enemies. Allowing the player to do this completely trivializes the combat, because now instead of having to get up close and fight enemies with melee, I can just grab them and throw them into a conveniently placed set of spikes on the wall. I would say that this is an oversight by the developers, but right after you get the grip, they put you in a room where you're encouraged to throw enemies into these traps to kill them instantly. And these traps are prevalent throughout the whole game, showing this is what you're supposed to do. To illustrate how big of a difference this one change makes, let's go back and look at Dead Space again. If you have played through Dead Space, then you would remember one specific sequence where Isaac is on a gondola, and as you slowly approach your stop, you see a set of necromorphs waiting for you. As they come into your frame, you frantically get out any weapon you have, and with your back against the wall, you quickly try to take out the ensuing threat, all while panicking, as you are helpless to stop yourself from getting closer to the enemy. Now let's take a look at Callisto Protocol and see how a similar scene plays out.
It's full of those things.
Are you serious?
The other way the game fails in helplessness is with weapon upgrades. When engaging in melee combat, you will most be using a baton. One upgrade for this baton is the block break. Its description reads, will break an assailant's arm if they block an officer's melee attack. The problem that arises here is the enemies you fight will always block at least one of your attacks, meaning this upgrade will always break their arm. Once their arm is broken, whatever enemy you are fighting has just become slightly easier, as now instead of attacking 2 or even 3 times, they can only attack once, making it extremely easy to dodge and launch a counterattack, once again trivializing the combat and making the enemies extremely easy to defeat, in turn making them less scary. The developers also talk about how they wanted the player to feel helpless in the documentary.
I look at helplessness as a physical condition. Helplessness, I don't have enough ammo. I don't have the right weapon. I don't know what to do here.
It really should be a situation where, based on sort of scarcity of resources, that you feel like, only by the skin of your teeth are you getting through every single encounter.
When I heard them say this, I was genuinely confused, because while there are guns in the game, you don't need them. As I showed off before, the baton and the grip glove are all you need to survive, so having no ammo is not a problem at all, especially in a game built around melee combat. Humanity is the last tenet of Callisto Protocol, and just like the other tenets, this one also fails. The characters in this game are extremely shallow and bland. Jacob as a protagonist is also a very uninteresting one who lacks any agency. Throughout the game, Jacob is being told what to do and where to go, first by Elias and then by Danny. We never see Jacob take or talk about taking an action, like a proactive character would. The game also does a horrible job at making the player feel like they are Jacob. Many impactful parts of this game are cutscenes that take control away from the player. We just have to sit there and watch as Jacob does all these things again and again, and with each second that goes by we feel more and more disconnected. This problem is also compounded with the fact that some things in the game are QuickTime events. From opening a door to actually fighting some enemies, these QTEs again limit the player's control of both Jacob and the environment, making Jacob as a character feel less human. The original Dead Space had a character problem that was way worse than Jacob though, as Isaac was a silent protagonist in the original Dead Space, which is as blank as a character as someone can make. So how did Dead Space still turn out to be a titan of horror while Callisto Protocol fails? It's because Isaac has a driving factor connecting him to the story. Nicole, Isaac's wife, is used as sort of a carrot on a stick, pushing the player forward through the horrors of the USG Ishimura. Jacob does not have a driving factor connecting him to the Black Iron prison, So in turn, Jacob is much less an interesting character. In reality, the game should have been based around one of the side characters, like Elias or Danny. It would have been much more interesting to play as them, as they're directly involved with the horrors of Black Iron Prison in one way or another. The game also fails in humanity because of the voice acting and motion capture. Jacob never really feels scared reacting to the horrors of Black Iron Prison. As we discover and see the horror spread across every inch of this prison, Jacob reacts in very underwhelming ways, again making him feel less human, but also because we are living vicariously through Jacob, the player never really buys into the threat these monsters impose solely because of the reactions of Jacob. Callisto Protocol failed to deliver in each of the 5 tenets the game was based on. But what if these documentaries were never made? What if the game wasn't sold on these lies? Would it still be considered a failure? I believe the answer to this question is yes. You see, I do not think the game is bad simply because of its lies. I believe the game is bad because it's painfully generic and felt too much like other games I'd already played. Coincidentally, it felt too much like other games Glenn Schofield has worked on. As I played through the Callisto Protocol, everything I did reminded me of something I had already seen. The first similarity is pretty apparent, and it's one I've touched on many a times, and that's Dead Space. I genuinely did try to separate the two as I played, but everything is so similar. The heads-up display is almost identical, certain scenes play out the exact same way, and combat is really the only difference. But about halfway through Callisto Protocol, you have a couple of ranged weapons that you can use, making the game feel even more like Dead Space. Enemies like the Two-Head as well can't be damaged with melee attacks, meaning during those combat sequences, you are essentially playing a worse version of Dead Space. Jacob's look is also very similar to Isaac's, both having their health displayed and telekinesis energy on their back. Moving on to the creatures we fight, and I couldn't help but critical of just how generic they look. They look less like world-destroying threats and more like run-of-the-mill zombies. They reminded me especially of Call of Duty zombies. More specifically, the zombies of Call of Duty World War II, which Glenn Schofield was a director on. All in all, to me, Callisto Protocol never truly felt like a unique experience. The character I was playing as was uninteresting, and the enemies I was fighting were boring. The environment I was trying to immerse myself in never felt real, and neither did the characters I was interacting with. The game does try to pull on the heartstrings a bit, but was never given the proper time to actually develop anything worthwhile. When all was said and done, I finished the game in 7.5 hours, and a week removed from the credits, I found myself constantly having to go back to my notes to remember anything as the game failed to be memorable in any way, offering little to no set pieces. This game was a disappointment in the eyes of many, and if a sequel is in the works, hopefully it does a better job at mastering horror. As always, I'm Soapy, and thanks for watching.